Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our second segment of our Team Science series. Our speaker today and also the speaker for the past session is Dr. Darshana Shah. She is a professor of pathology and the Associate Dean for the Office of Faculty Affairs and Professional Development at Marshall University Joan C. Edwards School of Medicine, and she is also one of the leaders in the Professional Development Corps for the CTSI. So we are pleased to have her with us today, and I'll turn it over to Darshana.
Thank you, Julie. And once again, on behalf of West Virginia CTSI Professional Development Corps, I would like to welcome everybody for our second webinar. Today, we're going to basically focus on the fundamental of team dynamics. And also, I had to confess that the Zoom is pretty good, but whenever you try to deliver the team concept, talking to a computer doesn't do that justice. But I think we're going to try to work it out. So in my last session, we talked about why the team science has become very important. And I had actually a couple of slides which I've pulled out from my previous presentation. One of them was obesity epidemic and the need of team to work together to take care of this epidemic. And the example, what I had shown was the obesity map. And also highlighted a few of the team, which are the researcher and chronologist, as I've listed here on my slide. They all need to probably work together, and the map actually has very nicely schematically shown. And this pretty much goes very well with the Henry Ford's quote of coming together is a beginning, keeping together is a progress, and working together is a success. And I felt that this would be a very nice segue for us to get started into today's topic. But before I do that, I again wanted to pull out some of the slides from my previous presentation and also differentiate that there is a difference between working group and team. And this has been studied probably in early 80s and 90s by a lot of organizational psychologists, communication expert. And the science of team contributes to team effectiveness. So that is the reason it is important for us to study how the team function, and the dynamic is the one which we will be actually talking about. I also wanted to actually share the article and just wanted to share the one came in Harvard Business Review in January issue. And the title was pretty catchy, which says the great teams are all about personality. It's not just skill. And today's topic, what we will be talking about is actually understanding of this dynamic. So what are the team dynamics and why are they important? How do individual factor will influence the team dynamics? And how do individual factor and team dynamics, we can actually help us to make it more effective or the productive way in the scientific teams. So this is slide, I've actually, it's a courtesy slide from some of the lead folks who are actually very active in science of team science. And they have used this slide, Team Science and Collaboration Guide, which NIH had published in 2010. And once again, I would like to emphasize just with my previous presentation that NIH has got some very, very absolutely amazing resources. And the Team Science Collaboration Field Guide, which was actually published in 2010, which is, I think they are going to revise it in the first of the year, but it's still a very good source. So taken from that, it just shows that if the dynamic or the team dynamic is functional or it's actually working, what are the criteria? So it's going to offer for open communication, safe environment, team members feel valued, value others, what problems are brought up, they're addressed, shared expectation, how conflict will be handled, perception, decision. So those are the one if your team is really functional. And in the arena which we are right now dealing, so we in our team, and not necessarily we have a people from different specialty, but we also have graduate student, postdoctoral fellows, junior faculty member, and also the senior faculty member who are probably leading in a lot of the scientific discovery. So I think it's important that they still feel as part of the team and people feel comfortable and the platform is open. So what this slide basically represents, that one should feel comfortable asking questions, bringing any of the issue they have related to the topic, and if it's in a perfect world, if the dynamic is very functional, then that will be keeping that platform very open communication. And I won't read the slide about if it's not working, what's going to happen. And those are the time which you basically have created a culture which people have afraid of actually bringing up the issues. And as I said, that again, guiding back to the team science collaboration field guide, this has been explained very well. So what is team dynamic? And if you really look at the word team dynamic, or look at the literature on team dynamics, there are several definitions, but basically team dynamic is the unconscious psychological force that influences the direction of team's behavior and performance. It's pretty much like an undercurrent of the undercurrent in the sea. When you have the sailboat may take a different direction on the sail, and the team dynamics is the one pretty much can do the same thing with the team. If your dynamic is functional, then the team can achieve good things. But if the dynamic is not working, then it can also it can actually create an unproductive, demotivated folks who will actually not be able to deliver the result. So basically, in team dynamics, as I said, it's an interpersonal skill, individual factor, and together how they contribute to the team is going to decide the functionality of the team. So once again, looking at some of the literature on team dynamics, so they say there are several influencers, because again, this is psychological influence or undercurrent, which actually makes the team success. And the psychological influencer, again, I'm not a psychologist and I don't claim to be one, but there's enough literature for us as a biomedical scientist to review to see how these has been studied way back in 80s and so the first one, which I actually brought, is the group dynamic, is by Kurt Lewin, which is almost in the era of 1945. And he was a social psychologist. And his goal was basically, he was interested in studying how people interact and what are the common perceptions which arise within the group. Now, this is a little bit new for us as a scientist, because I think these are a lot of soft skill aspect of, we basically do not focus on interaction, but we are actually ready to do the real science. And when you look at the literature on the dynamics, it's all about interpersonal skill. It's all about individual factor. There was another, in literature, they also talks about the FIDO human element. And this is the theory to measure and predict the interaction or the foundation of interpersonal relationship. So there is lots of literature on that too. But how people are compatible, how those behavior relate to inner feelings of significance, competence, likability. So those are the one has been also very well published. The third one you may be very familiar with is a Myers-Briggs type indicator, which is a personality type. And I think a lot of time now in team science, preparing the team, it may be important to probably understand one's personality. And the purpose of the Myers-Briggs type is the goal of knowing about personality, understand and appreciate that we are all different human being in a way that in the terms of human factor. The team dynamics, another influencer, are also non-psychological influencer. And again, since our time is very limited, I don't intend to spend too much time explaining that, but I've given some of the author's name on the slide. And I think even if you Google it out, you'll probably find enough information. Organizational culture, structure, leadership management, and the method. So those are the considered influencer of team dynamics. And once again, with respect to what we do, of course, the culture is what one does and how they relate to each other in an organization. And that's, again, different from individual institution. And since team science bring multi-site or multi-institutional approach, we all have a different perception of how one should be working. So those kind of things may influence when you try to work in the team. The hierarchical structure of the organization is also important because that will also affect the dynamics. And as we go forward this presentation, you probably get a little bit more clarity about this slide. And to give an example that a lot of times, especially in our academic institution, the way the reward, recognition, individual leadership, management practice, those things are, again, not necessarily that clear or maybe not transparent, and that can actually create or influence the dynamic. The methodology is pretty much of the management, some of the way people run their meetings, the way they share information, how they communicate. So these are some of the processes can also affect the team dynamics. Now, I just wanted to start with the IPO model. And again, if you look at the organizational psychology, there are tons of literature on it, but this is basically an old one by McGrath, and this was an industrial psychologist. And basically, this just gives a framework of what is a team dynamic model. So it's just the way you have an input, process, and outcome. But here, the input in a simple model, which was probably, this was done way in 1940s, but then you had the input is all your resources, and that would be organizational, team, individual. Process is how these resources are delivered, and then what outcome or the performance is measured. Now, this model is pretty simple, but the complexity is added when you try to look in the terms of team science. So in individual, again, there are competency, personality types, as I just mentioned in my earlier slide. So those things will definitely influence the task, again, the complexity of the task, how much interdependency is needed in team science, how it is structured, the leadership is also will probably add another layer. And then the culture and the structure, as I showed in earlier. So those are all the influencer, which can affect in team science. So this is the conceptual framework, and that actually was published in the National Academy of Press, Enhancing the Effectiveness of Team Science. And this is the basically framework is given. And then what I would like to go over a little bit to share with you that whenever you have, it's an integrated or the cyclic process. So you have a team composition, and whenever you say team composition is they are the individual members. So that's individual member, they also have their own knowledge, attitude, and skill set. We all come at a different level. And again, giving you the same scenario as a junior faculty member, a graduate student, a postdoctoral fellow. So we all have in the team, those things are still different as far as knowledge, the attitude and skills are different. The team's composition will also have the size, structure, who is leading the team. And all of these combined factors can actually shape, leverage, or align the process, because that's going to be helping you how the team processes are going to work. So if we are, what I mean by this, that if there is a project, again, taking up with the obesity map I showed, so you have a researcher who's working in lipid metabolism, and they have certain thing to add. But the researcher has not been outside the lab, but whenever that person works with an epidemiologist or works with an internist, or the language will have to be a little bit different. In the same scenario, you can also say in this team, you have a postdoctoral student who actually have a terminal degree, but they're still trying to learn the language of research skill. But then if the environment is not created, and the hierarchy is still maintained, they may be an important piece as an individual team member, but they may not become a part of the team because their knowledge or even their skill set may be a little bit different. So they all come at a different level, but to form a fully functional team, there are certain rules have to be followed. So the team process, and then I think in this particular slide, as I said, it's a conceptual framework, just giving an idea how complex it has become. So the science of team is again an evolving discipline, but now I think we are bringing social scientists and psychologists to help us understand how can we make this team function. I think in my last presentation last month, I had shown you there are several models are available in a business world, which tells you about the characteristic of a successful teams. And there are a few which I have listed. So Heckman, who was Heckman was an organizational psychologist, and basically in his study, he found that there is a clear goal or a direction, good leadership, organization which is very supportive in providing resources, and then the task which is complex enough so that you need an interdependency related group member who can actually work in a very cohesive way, and that would be characteristic of will be a successful team. Then you have a Larson and LaFasto. Again, you can really review that literature if that interests you. But that basically, he came up with, he was an expert again in group communication. And he also said that if there's a clear goal, clear direction, also good leadership, organizational support. And then he added in his research that there is a mutual accountability plays a very important role in a successful team. So giving that example, if you have a graduate student and a postdoc and you have a faculty mentor, and if in an idea, if the faculty mentor, even the postdoc or a graduate student may have something very important to share, and that idea probably did not take off because again, if in the hierarchy level, but the faculty decided to pick up an idea, and if that didn't work, but then you would not actually accept because it's again, your role is a little bit different. So I think working in scientific team, the accountability does not, the title and the rank does not have to play a role. One has to be accountable whenever they work in a team. So in case of Larson and LaFasto, this is what he picked up. Now, Kassenbach and Smith and a lot of Harvard Business Review has a lot of articles in similar group, and I think 1993 was the one, probably several article was published. But in one of the things, I think his basically expertise is a management expert. So they generally study small number of group or the teams who are actually in the management leading the organization. And in his finding, he basically discovered, again, clear goal, mutual accountability, the task, the complementary skill set, all that will basically be a successful teams. So again, these models are presented in organizational or industrial psychology or also in a management style, but some of them still do give us an idea how we can probably apply them to team science. The one which I wanted to actually bring it up, and I probably have to apologize for the overlapping this on slide. This probably is another slide which I bring it back from my presentation from last time. So the previous slide we discussed about what are the criteria or the characteristic, and I think the Patrick Lencioni model of the dysfunctional team actually I thought was pretty much hit home, because that actually tells you what are the factors which will prevent you to develop a strong team. So I think that gives a very little bit of a different angle than what we are trying to study through the other model which I described earlier. So I think in Lencioni's model, he puts the trust as the bottom. So, and in team dynamics, trust is very, very important. One has to trust one another, not only for the scientific data, but also their ability to believe and trust one another as far as an individual or person. And I think we did discuss that at our last Team Science 101 lecture. So trust, he puts it at bottom because he said, one, if the trust is developed, then a lot of these things will blend in very easily. The other factor which will actually prevent the team to build is the fear of conflict. And majority of, and especially people in the leadership, that people don't like to actually deal with conflict. And the conflict does not have to be always bad. You can also promote the healthy conflict. It could be the discussion or around an idea. But I think if the fear of conflict will actually limit people to actually build a true team dynamic. And I think I've got several other slides to show you as we move on. If you have actually conflict, then there's a lack of commitment, is the people aren't basically committed to the task, and not necessarily it'll be just the team member, but as I showed earlier in my slide from the effectiveness of team IPO model, that you also have the commitment of your organizational leadership or institutional leadership, how well they are invested into the project or the task the team has taken up. So this goes system-based. It's not just the group which is working in that area. Then avoidance of accountability. And this is, again, if there's a fear of conflict, no one wants to hold other accountable for their work. And I think this is another factor which can actually limit one to build the team. And the team has an intention to the results, that it's, again, a personal goal become more important than the success of the group. And I think you will also probably, as we go over this session, you will also learn that sometimes I think when you are in the team, there is no I in the team. And sometimes the dynamic is shifted when you have a person who basically cannot be part of the team, and he or she takes success individually more than the success of the team. So how to improve the results? So these are the factor probably will play a role, and each of these can be individually, they actually relate to individual person, and also can actually apply to the team as a team. Okay. So the next, what I would like to share is the similar slide which I had when we did the Team Science 101. Because before we understand the dynamic, it may be important to again go over those, how do the team is formed, the Tuckman forming, storming, norming, and performing model. And I'm just going to highlight a couple of things here, that whenever the dynamic, which is the part which we have to be mindful of. And if you recall from my last month's presentation, I think the forming stage is basically you have uneven commitment. So individually, so people are just getting together. If there was an idea or a project, it is still at individual level. You're not still sure, but here you have you're still, I'm part of the project or I'm part of the group, and it's still the I, not the we concept. Interpersonally, you're still not sure who your other team members are. So the trust is not built yet, or the connection is not built yet. So there's going to be communication. You may probably want to say something, but you may not, because I'm not sure I still belong to the team. So there's still in a forming stage, is still those things have to work out. Even people meet in a group, and still if the mission or the goal is not clear, the roles and responsibility is not clearly defined, there are no guidelines, then this is again, it's still, I consider this as a pseudo team because it's not completely blended. Unclear about the task, no feedback, blaming, culture of blame, and justify for any mistake we make. So this is still, those are the still things which is in a forming whenever you go through the Tuckman model. If you recall from our last talk, that the storming, and just the way the name suggests, and this is a very, very crucial stage in team building, which affects the dynamic. So in storming stage, one has to actually have start working on the shared vision, have to have a processes in place that how one is going to communicate, how they're going to manage the conflict, how the leadership has to articulate the expectation. They have to also define roles and responsibility. So in this storming stage of team building, the leadership will play a very, very key role. So what I'm going to do is probably highlight a couple of things which will actually affect the team dynamic, not only with the building the team, because many time or majority of the time, if the team fails because they could not pass through the storming stage. So just let's look at it. How do storming stage can be overcome and what generally happens and what dynamics we need to be concerned about. So one is the, as I mentioned to you, that during the storming phase, there are a lot of still uncertainty, and they also become the source of conflict. If the clarity is not given, so you can have, again, a team of folks together to do a project, not necessarily clear about each of the site, what they are supposed to do. The interdependence task, which is you have a dependency on team member for collection of certain data. And then if that clarity is not given, time is not set up, that can actually also create a lot of conflict. So I think the slide is listed on all of this bullet, which we'll quickly go over, and that is actually going to be the one which has to be sorted out during the storming phase. The process that needs to be placed. You also have to have another thing is there is also sometimes the conflict arise because poor feedback mechanism. So we are very good at starting to get the task taken off the ground. Few things probably we may fail if it is a graduate student or also a junior researcher. Are we giving them feedback? Is there a feedback mechanism in place? If it's a mentor and mentee, what kind of feedback mechanism is in place and how they are functioning? And in team science, I think another thing which you will hear, there is also team mentoring. So again, we keep adding the complexity. And if these things are not in place, the storming phase, the team does not become cohesive. There is also conflict in personality between team members. And as I mentioned to you in my earlier slide, that Myers-Briggs, there are several personality type testing. And I think one we have used in our course is the PACE color palette. And basically just brings an awareness to my personal preference and the way I like to communicate. And also my awareness of my team members are in which way they would like to communicate. And I think it's team building is not only about knowing about what I like, but what others like is also important. So storming phase is, once again, one has to really learn about these differences. Lot of time, I think there is also a lot of disagreement in strategy, like how do you want to, what is the next action plan? And I think I'm very proud to be part of this PDC team, and I give a credit to Julie that we have worked at least launching few things being on the same page. And that's very, very important because the expectations have to be sorted out way early on. Many times the poor planning, and again, as a team, one has to decide that how the task is going to be allocated, who is going to be delivering the task, how it's going to be communicated. And in team science, as we know that there are so many different parties are involved, and they really have to have learned the language of how this is going to be executed. Storming phase is the time which you really have to be getting rid of the blame culture, and that's the common norm. We probably all grew up with, it's not my fault, I didn't do that. And I think that's the phase one has to really have a self-awareness and also make sure that taking care of the team member. So these are another way one has to really work hard to come out of the storming phase. Self-centeredness is, again, probably each individual have that characteristic, but when you work in the team, it definitely throws the dynamic off. A lot of time, and you will probably have met in your career or in your professional life, you will have folks who will just do things so they can get recognized, their CV can get enhanced, and then there are folks who are just passionate about the project, passionate about the cause. So you will have a very different type of sort of a delivery of these individuals who they are in your team, because they really have to keep team-centered more than self-centered. And another thing is the fear of failure, and this is again comes down to the environment, how the team is built, and that again, that environment can actually take care of it if it is done right. You will have the conflict can be resolved. Since I had mentioned that the leadership plays such an important role, and storming phase is another time for the leader to probably show that their presence. And this is taken again from Team Science Collaboration Guide. But the one thing which I wanted to just, and I may not want to probably go too much expand on this slide, but basically the good leader is the one who can articulate team's vision. And not only articulate, so, and this is something was told by one of my mentor, that if you can draw the picture, which, your mental map can be actually easily, invisible mental map can be read by your team. And that is the way the leader probably should have that able to articulation. Clearly, decisive communicate to share information within the team members are also, again, belongs to the culture, how you create, how comfortable you are feeling about a task. And same example, and I apologize since we have a lot of PhD students, but I've been in that seat, and I know that you may want to say a few things, and sometimes if the culture is not created, you may not want to because you're looking at the task. If I say something, it may probably affect my career, and this happens also a lot, not only to the graduate student or a PhD student, but a junior faculty member. The fear factor is there, and this is where I think the leader can actually have a very different way change the culture. The defensive leadership is the bad leadership, because a lot of time people can say there's always an excuse for a failure, and I don't think the true leader would have that. So support and empowering the team member is the one the leadership role. And this is again taken from the Team Science Guide. The true leader has to be having the eye to capitalize one's strength. And I think this is where it is not about managing the people in your team, but basically managing the talent or recognizing the one strength and then looking at it as a portfolio of strength would be the way to build the team. Situational leadership, and in team science, as I mentioned and showed you the obesity map, in the team science pretty much forms like the situational leadership. So any team member who has the skill to manage the situation at hand should be allowed to do that. So there is not one defined role, and whichever task, if there was a presentation to a research scientist, then you can have a researcher in your team become the leader. If there is a presentation in an epidemiology world, then you have an epidemiologist who's working with you can take the lead. But in this case, I think we can probably have this when we try to work this in person, how these has to be decided. And there is also a couple of papers, I've given you at the end of this presentation, that there is also like collaborative contract you can have a team member sign. And those things become way early on, and your storming phase would be the phase to do it. This slide also taken from the courtesy slide from Julie Thompson and her group. They've used the Team Science collaborative guide. And when the team is dynamic and the power of conflict has been removed, when it's working, when there is people leave the title and rank at the door. And I think this is very important, because when you work here to solve a problem, the title or the rank probably does not have a place. But I think, again, for us in academic institution, it is very, very difficult to do that. All the ideas are welcome. And I also, in one of the leadership training, I do remember meeting a Marshall Board of Governor at the time. And in her things about leading the team, one of the things she had said that she's actually a CEO of one of the company. And she had said that she has a day which she has employee from all over her company, regardless of the title. They all have to come, and it's an idea brainstorming session. And I just thought that was pretty cool. But again, as a scientist, we probably will be hard for us to do that. So all idea has to be welcome, whether they are a graduate student, postdoc, or a junior faculty. Interpersonal civility, is also maintained when everything is working well. Open explanation, motivation, rationale, methodology, all that is already established. So this slide basically just summarizes if your team is dynamic and it's working, you will see, as I have taken the slide from Julie Thompson and her group. Whenever you're trying to do this team building phase, the key is the communication. And so communication is, again, verbal and nonverbal. And for that, I think there are several probably, whether we are trying to resolve or discuss an idea or confront a conflict, how you do it is not what you do, but how you do is very important. And the communication, as I said, that it is your thoughts will create your behavior. And so if I'm listening to a graduate student, but my mind is saying it's just a graduate student, then that will come up in expression, posture, gesture, and that can actually affect the team. Or if I'm talking to somebody at a higher other institution, again, what thought process I have that will actually affect my communication. Your tone, your choice of word, and that is going to be very, very important, an important aspect when you're trying to understand the team dynamic or build the team dynamic. And I wanted to just share this, which I thought was, and some of you probably have already seen, but Alex or the Sandy Petlin in HBR had published this article, and I just thought that was pretty cool. So whatever I think in a theory we have learned that if your behavior changes the way how you perceive and your perception, he has got something called those sociometric badge, and there's an MIT lab or the Media Lab. They basically have people wear that and they collect the data on communication, behavior, body language, tone of voice, to whom they talk, how much they talk, and they're actually trying to collect the science behind it. And I just thought that by comparing the data, they're actually gathering the individual on the team and how the team is performing. So now there is a science actually can tell you that when people say that I was in a team meeting and I never got a chance to speak or no one allowed me to speak, there's actually a data because they actually track all that. And I think this is a very interesting read. I've just listed the reference at the bottom. And I said, so this just shows that the communication, verbal, non-verbal, is also going to be very, very important whenever you try to build the team. Now, there's a lot of things is coming out, again, in those soft skill is emotional intelligence or emotional quotient. I think we had talked about that EQ, the book which I had actually shared at my last presentation. But it is also important because your communication, whenever you're communicating, how strong you have EI or emotional intelligence, how strong you are, how self-aware or how much do you self-reflect is going to affect a lot whenever you are in a team. Because self-awareness is the ability to identify their own emotion and to discuss one's emotion and ability how I can regulate their emotions. So when you are in a scientific or the team meeting, and there are things you really have to be aware about, not necessarily how you will address an issue, but if I said something, if I called out and said this data was absolutely not correct, how I say it is going to be very, very important. Or somebody accusing that to me, saying that this data is not valid or you did not follow the deadline, the paper was due today. Again, these kind of dynamics will affect a lot. So self-awareness is just awareness about their self, and just there's a slide listed here. And then empathy is if I really wanted to call out on somebody, cause accountable how that person is and how that person is going to feel. So I think these, again, are very, very area which was hard for a scientist, biomedical scientist, to actually focus on. But that has become right now an important skill for one to develop. And that will also affect your communication, the conflict which you're trying to resolve. The emotional regulation is, again, how do you manage your own emotion? Because that it's an important aspect, affects the team dynamic because that helps you build the relationship. And team is all about relationship building and management, and that is your norming stage whenever we try to go through the same Tuckman model. Okay, I think any question, because my slides probably got a little bit changed. So these are some of the resources I wanted to share, and actually wanted to leave some time too, because I think last time we didn't have any time for question. But few things I want to highlight is the NCI has a really great team science toolkit. And the toolkit is searchable, so you can actually look at lots and lots of articles from organizational psychologists, industrial psychologists, to also a lot of articles on how the team dynamic functions. Personally, for me, initiating the course, the Team Science Field Guide was absolutely amazing resource. And I think they have, Dr. Bennett has actually also published several articles. And she shared a couple of articles while I had just posted on the listserv. So they are very, very active in that. So if you have any other resource you're looking for, the group is very dynamic. So these are the two resources I wanted to share with you. And I think what we will do is we will probably even, if needed, we can also post it on our West Virginia CTSI PDC site. That's all I had for today, and I'm going to leave some time for questions.